Start in about 1 minute.
1 minute? What's that?
Okay. Well, the house doesn't exist anymore. It was known down in the 50s. What was it called? Your Holton? William Holton. H-E-L-T. I'm going to look him up.
Don't speak into the microphone. Nobody ever hears you.
James, do we stand up or do we keep sat
I'm
down?
going to stand up. I think it would be easier if you could stand up.
Okay.
But whatever you feel comfortable with, as long as the microphone is picking you up, you'll be fine.
If you stand up, the microphone's not going to be.
I'm going to because I feel as if I'm under the table because I'm so small.
It is a bit, yeah.
Yeah, I think some of them will struggle at the back there to see us, won't they?
Yeah. So it's better to stand up.
Well, you take me. You're good.
Literally 1 minute, ladies and gentlemen. We were ready a little earlier, but I thought I said 1 minute, so 1 minute's run out. Good evening and welcome. It's really wonderful to see so many of you here at our Fringe event. It's probably the most remote room in the building, the hardest one to get to, but it's got the most spectacular view and perhaps the most spectacular debate this evening too. So we represent community pharmacy. I'm on the National Pharmacy Association Board of Directors, and we represent independent community pharmacy throughout the UK. This evening we've got James Cusack, who's our very able host, and a very informed panel that he has, and I'll leave him to introduce the panel. But it's all about community pharmacy and how we relieve the pressure and help save the NHS. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to James.
Hi, thank you. Just a quick introduction. My name is James Cusack. I'm the former political correspondent at The Independent. Before that at Newsnight and the Sunday Times, and now one of the editors. Can you hear me at the back? You can't hear me at the back. Can you hear me now? Are you sure? Okay, I'll just raise my voice as high. And now an editor at Open Democracy. Quick introduction before I introduce tonight's panel speakers. Can I say a few words about what we'll effectively be discussing? Now, the title of the event is Relieving the Pressure, Pharmacy's Role in Saving the NHS. Now, there's a key word in that headline, and it's saving. And it's based on the assumption, right or wrong, that the NHS, our NHS, is under existential threat and it needs rescuing. That's usually what the word save means. And if you were looking at the NHS, perhaps as a dispassionate economist, it could be described as a £120 billion industry with 1.7 million connected staff, making it the 5th largest employer in the world. Now, any industry of that size is going to be under pressure in a hard commercial market, regardless. And that pressure is probably to explain what it does and how it does it. It faces rising demand, and I think crucially, rising expectations from all of us about what we want from the NHS. And the end result is we have NHS GPs struggling to cope. We have hospital accident emergencies operating on the edge, not occasionally operating on the edge, but operating on the edge every day. And tonight in this room, over a couple of hours, I hate to tell you, we're not going to be able to solve that problem. And I don't even think we're going to come close. But we will hear, I think, about a key component of the health sector that believes it can do more with less. In case you think I've got that wrong, I'll repeat it. Can do more with less. Now, the UK has around 12,000 pharmacies, many of them a key part of their local communities. And they are in a unique position, I would say, to ease pressure on GPs and hospital A&Es. They are effectively what I would term a health resource in waiting, or untapped in its full potential. And pilot studies have shown that they can do more and want to do more. They're capable of running minor ailments clinics, offering advice and assisting with health and diet, on patient screening. They can do more on anything from hypertension to diabetes. And with a lot of effort and technology that's already there, this is not invented technology we're asking about. They're already capable, I think, with a very short jump, of almost adding 5,000 GPs, the equivalent of 5,000 GPs, to what we already have. Now, the government's response to all of this, as a journalist who's been watching and listening both in Westminster and, unfortunately, inside the High Court, is that both the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, and the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, both back plans to cut the current network of community pharmacies. They want new, they want innovative, they want digital, they want supply solutions. So does every industry want these things. But crucially, they want the government expenditure minimised. Community pharmacists say the government has failed to fully understand the potential of what doing more with less actually means and what this industry has to do to now deliver that. And that's, I think, what we'll be trying to explore this evening with a panel who know more about this than most people. Can I introduce them very quickly? At the very far end, we have Dr. James Noyes. Now, he's a writer and academic and currently head of policy and strategy at the Res Publica think tank. Now, it was founded in 2009 by Philip Blond, and it's sometimes been called one of the intellectual cradles of progressive conservatism. So I'm told Dr. Noyes is with us tonight without a security guard, because most of those are all on duty outside the BBC, I'm told. He's the author of The Politics of Iconoclasm, which is a book looking at the history of violence which has taken place in the name of religion. Now, one reviewer said of Dr. Noyes' books, it sheds new light on the relation between the sacred, the political, and the material worlds of the modern age. Now, we're in Brighton at the Labour conference, so two of those terms were familiar to us. That's political and sacred, and obviously that's a reference to any Jeremy Corbyn speech. We have Ian Strachan. He's been chair of the National Pharmacy Association since 2014. He's worked as a forensic scientist at the Home Office Laboratories in Aldermaston, was at university here in Brighton, graduating with a degree in pharmacy, and he's worked as a teacher and a consultant over the last 10 years, because this is in the consumer and healthcare industry. He owns and runs 4 pharmacies in northwest England, and therefore, if anybody's asking questions, we can safely assume that Ian is one of those on the front line of community pharmacy. And we have Julie Cooper. Now, she's the MP for Burnley and Paddingham. She was appointed Shadow Minister for Community Health in October 2016 and has also served on the Health Select Committee. She's a qualified secondary school teacher and with her husband actually ran a local pharmacy. Now, I'm told, and this is reasonably controversial, she shares views on the future with one Alistair Campbell. Now, that has nothing to do with politics, apparently, but both of them are delusional in believing that Burnley can win the Premiership sometime soon. And Jeremy Taylor. He has been a senior official at the Treasury and since 2009 has been Chief Executive of National Voices. That's the coalition of health and care charities in England. He and his organisation provide a strong strategic voice for the engagement of citizens in decisions about health. And in August this year, for, apparently I'm told, the 7th year running, he was named in the Health Service Journal's annual list of the top 100 most influential people in health. Now, there's another Jeremy on that list, but he's not managed to make it here tonight, Mr. Hunt. So rather than listen to all the panel completely, what I want them each to do is speak for whatever length of time they want to introduce their subject, and then I'll throw questions open to the floor. We'll have a Q&A, and then I'll bring each of them in just now. So from the beginning, don't feel as if you have to hold back. And can I ask just one question? Is there any professional pharmacists, community pharmacists in this evening? Can I show of hands? Oh, plenty. Anybody working in the health sector? Or is it? Right, so an educated audience, and please feel free to come in straight away. None of these people are shy and retiring, and if you assault them, please, that's what we're here for. And as I say, we've got 2 hours, so, let's have fun. So I'm going to call on the first speaker, which I wrote down in order, and that's going to be Ian to speak first. Mr. Strachan.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. The biggest question people ask of me is why? Why are they doing this? I mean, all the newspapers, the radio, all the external messages that are going out is that we should use pharmacy first. And that's what's coming out, that's what's resounding out there. And yet we're facing right now policies which are inflexible. There are odds with the public, patients, with community pharmacists, and they're even at odds with MPs. I mean, you look at that Westminster debate, and right across the parties, all parties were aligned in that respect. They all understood the value of community pharmacy. They got it. But this is the challenge that we're facing right now, because policy isn't aligned with evidence or economic reason. It's literally destroying the dreams and the hopes of thousands of undergraduates. I mean, in pharmacy right now, university places in some universities have been, as I understand it, 50% down. There's a charity group called Pharmacy Support. They're receiving right now 2,000 hits on the website for undergraduates who are looking for alternative careers or to work abroad. They're stripping out the hopes and dreams of community pharmacists. And it's a shame, and it's absolutely disgraceful. And if you take away the face-to-face care that an undergraduate expects and hopes for and aspires to, if you take that away from a doctor, if you take that away from a pharmacist, to put a model inside a room 70 times the size of this, with no windows, with a robot, and think that you can commoditise medicines like jelly beans and send them out in a jiffy bag like Amazon, as if you're ordering a record or a CD, that's the kind of thinking that we've got right now. You don't need me to remind you of what Jeremy Hunt said in a letter to Theresa May, which basically said that it's an over-subsidised market that's in need of reform, and we need less reliance upon high street community pharmacies. If you take that away from an undergraduate, if you take that away from a pharmacist, then they might as well not get out of bed in the morning. It is so important to a doctor, to a pharmacist. They're stripping away the hopes and dreams of them, and it's wrong. And it really is wrong. It's more than wrong, it's cruel. Because we're going to have a brain drain of talent, people who are aspiring to serve the communities, that care, that respect that pharmacists have. It's an absolute disgrace. And you know, if you truly want to reduce demand and bottlenecks in primary care and improve outcomes for patients, then it's got to be done through the community pharmacy network. Primary care and putting pharmacists in surgeries will not relieve bottlenecks. It will not reduce demand. It will not change patients' behaviours. It can't do. The system wasn't designed for that. And I've got evidence to support that. If you truly want to influence patient outcomes, improve lifestyle advice, change habits and change that behavioural support, then community pharmacists are the right people to do it. We're better at that than pharmacists in hospitals. We're better than that than a doctor. And it's not being elitist, it's because a doctor hasn't got time. A pharmacist sees a patient on average 35 to 40 times a year. A doctor with the most complex conditions might see a patient, 4 or 5 times a year. If you truly want to influence that, then you've got to use it. This is a network of highly trained professionals and staff who can detect ill health through testing and screening, and that surveillance of ill health can reduce the onset of more complex therapies and complications from stroke and heart disease. That blood pressure machine that we have on the counter downstairs, over there in the building, can detect a whole array of conditions that currently would require referral to a consultant, then a diagnosis, then a referral back. You've got this huge resource within the community pharmacy network, and it's so crucial. The answer is within community pharmacy, not this cliche, and it is a cliche, of clinical pharmacist. And for the reasons that I've just described. At the NPA, we've looked at a Canadian model, and through education, through consultations, through advice, through prescribing, we're able now to see that pharmacists can reduce systolic pressure by 18 millimetres. It's not that we're better than a doctor, we're not. It's purely because we've got access, we're convenient, and we see patients more frequently. So if you truly want to reduce demand on the system, if you truly want to reduce bottlenecks, and if you truly want to alleviate some of the demands on A&E and primary care, then the network is the place to do it. Because it is all about access. And really, that's my starter for 10. It's a simple message. It's not complicated. I do think the general public get it. I don't understand NHS England's thinking right now, but you know, it is getting to a point now where, and I think the Conservatives are burying their head in the sand to some degree about this. I think they delude themselves that it's all gone away. What's the problem? We've made the cut. But it's more than that, because it's a transformation, and it's a transformation that is designed to bypass the network. It's designed to commoditise it and automate it. It's an attempt to displace community pharmacists into this primary care environment in a surgery. It's not the answer. And that is my message to you. Thank you.
There's an interesting part of what Ian was saying there for anybody who sat through 3 or 4 days of the recent case in the High Court. And that was that I think that the government were unaware really of what impact the cuts would have, how it would fall. Now, they made a claim that 40% of all pharmacies were in a cluster where 3 or 4 pharmacies were within 10 minutes of each other. And I think what was argued during that course, that actually the Health Secretary had a duty to not just enforce equality, but to actually push further to make sure that inequality didn't happen. It was part of what he wanted to do. Now, I'd be interested in feedback straight away. Most pharmacies actually are in places where they're maybe the most GPs rather are in places where they're the least needed. In a wealthy part of the UK, a wealthy neighbourhood, a wealthy community, there will be plenty of GPs. In a less deprived community, the GPs is slightly less. So if you like, the pressure and the need for a pharmacy doing more than they're doing at the moment is crucial. And that kind of adds into what Ian is saying. It's not that the government, wish to save money and know exactly the outcome of what they're doing. They appear not to understand that, and that's part of, I think, this not meeting of minds. It's a crashing of minds, and it's awkward. Any immediate questions on that? Come on. The gentleman there. Can you address to any of the panel at all?
Stuart Grant from North Wiltshire, Royal Bassett. We've got a shortage of GP.
There's a microphone there, Stuart.
We've got a shortage of GP surgeries at the moment, where GPs are twice the national average number of patients. However, obviously, one of the cuts that's happening to pharmacies is that they're no longer able to do the repeat prescriptions for people. That's now going to be an online service that people will have to do themselves, DIY prescriptions ordering. And obviously, we have 2 GP surgeries and 3 pharmacists. But clearly the thing is that those pharmacists could take a lot of the strain off the GP surgeries and make a difference. But also, if they're having the things that they do well, which is the repeat prescriptions, although I understand that there was £1 million saving when they did an experiment in Swindon on reordering prescriptions, but that's something that just needs tightening up clearly, that not take it away from them. I don't know what your view on that is. That, is it something that you agree with, or do you think pharmacists should be doing that?
If I was to show you the waste, if you don't mind me taking that, the waste that we get back each month in medicines through the system, compliance. We've got in the audience tonight Sue Sharp. Sue Sharp's the head of negotiations at PSNC, and it was very much a tactic that we tried to get the government to engage in. Let us take ownership of repeat ordering of medication. We could have scrutinised every medicine from fibrogel to cocodamol. We could have phoned the patient. We could have engaged with them. We could have really got down to understanding and done a deep dive on what they've got. Do they really need it? And, if they'd have engaged with the sector to do that, pharmacists are not a bunch of rogues who are swimming in cash, who are trying to sort of bend the system. The network is there. It's a network of care. And that would have been an ideal. Now you're right, there's patches up and down the country who are, as you say, taking that responsibility away from pharmacies. They can't cope with what they've got. God knows how they're going to cope with requests for repeat prescriptions coming in every day. It's going to be an absolute... I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Sue.
Nothing particular, except to say this is a classic example of government or local level targeting the wrong problem. Use pharmacies, as Ian said. Use them wisely. Use them to manage medication. Use them to do much, much more to manage repeat medication. What we need to do, and we've been pushing for it for years, is to change the way that pharmacies are funding and the funding models so that we're properly paying pharmacies to look after patients and not just to supply medicines. Because what was going on that led to the Royal Wootton Bassett problems is just a feeling that pharmacies were incentivised to shovel out medicines patients don't need. It's rubbish, but to the extent that it's a perceived problem, it becomes a real problem. So let's tackle that, rather than, as Ian said, put more and more burden on general practice to do things which frankly aren't using the skills of the GP surgery or the teams within that. It's just absolute madness.
Anybody else? This lady here.
Hello, I'm Candy. I used to be a nurse prescriber, but I'm sort of semi-retired and not doing that now. But what I would say was there's a huge role for pharmacy in disease prevention or disease progression. So monitoring diabetes maybe, and you could titrate the doses of insulin or the need for whatever medication they're on to change, and therefore prevent the diabetes becoming a real issue. Yeah. So, and that's not the only thing. You could monitor the blood pressure of those on antihypertensives and really make a difference to the use of GPs, because there is a huge shortage of GPs everywhere. A neighbouring town to where I live in southeast Kent, Folkestone, have closed, all the GPs' surgeries have closed their doors to patients. There's thousands of patients that haven't got a GP, which is horrendous. Now, if that burden was lightened for the remaining GPs via pharmacies and other healthcare professionals too, then there wouldn't be such a problem. I mean, it goes a lot deeper than that. Politically, it goes a lot deeper. But there we are. So, yeah. These are the we're discussing at the moment the potential of what pharmacies can do, but cuts have arrived, and I think some pharmacies, because of reduced income, are looking at maybe opening hours being restricted, or looking at reducing staff, or looking at reduction of additional services, everything that was, if you like, a competitive part of what they do. So I think over the course of the next hour or so, maybe even experience of what the downside of this, the cuts could be, would be worth explaining. But before we do that, can I move now on to James? And he will. He has some new research that he wants to share with us, and let's just see where that takes us. James.
Thank you, James. Can you all hear me at the back?
Yes.
Right. I'm the wild card, and my only objective is to get to the end of this session without too many bullet holes. Thank you for using my academic title. I'm not a medical doctor, so if you've got any blood pressure problems, please don't come to me, because there's a danger of misdiagnosis. I'm head of policy at the think tank Res Publica, and one of the joys and disadvantages of such a role is that I have to stand and represent the organisation at panels like this. So I'll be doing the same with the gambling industry and with green belt urban development, and as I'm saying here, National Pharmacy Association. So in some ways, I'm a sort of general political analyst, if you like. And you said that we're at the forefront of conservative thinking. I think a lot of my colleagues at Res Publica would count themselves as Tories, but if you know anything about Philip Blond's work, he calls himself a red Tory. And for you Labour members here, I'm very much the red to the Tory in the organisation. So go easy on me. We've been commissioned by the National Pharmacy Association to provide a social and political rationale for community pharmacies. And we're delighted to have been approached by the organisation to do this. Why? Because we're interested in questions of localism, of thriving high streets, of civic well-being, and of anchor institutions, all the things that the Prime Minister has said should be at the heart of what she calls her agenda of social reform, but all of which we are seeing undermined by a culture of austerity. And as an organisation, we are sick of seeing these vital institutions in our communities undermined by government cuts. And we see what's facing community pharmacies very much as part of a wider pattern in other comparable institutions. So we feel that the clinical case for community pharmacies has already been well made. And you've discussed it this evening, reducing the strain on GPs, changing the public perception of public health and achieving savings to the public purse. And if you're interested in those savings, I urge you to read the PricewaterhouseCoopers report of 2016. What I'm interested in looking at is the social savings of community pharmacy and linking it to cultural, social and political questions of wider forms of inequality and poverty and access and well-being and, yes, injustice. And if we can cost those on a clinical level, and if we can map them across the country in a report like we saw by PwC, can we do the same from a social perspective as well? If we identify the main social challenges, let's say mental health or employment, the right to work, obesity, addiction, how can we overlap that onto the main public health concerns, obesity and diabetes and blood pressure, for example? What are the links, for example, between BMI and unemployment or mental health and social exclusion? And how can we show the work that community pharmacies can play in reducing those public health concerns and by effect, therefore reducing the social strain, the wider social strain on this country and on the taxpayer? So that's generally my sort of interest. I'm interested in looking at how community pharmacies extend into these wider questions of social well-being. And I would suggest that if the Prime Minister is serious about an agenda of social reform, and if she's serious about what she calls those people who are just about managing those jams, which you would have all read about in the newspapers, community pharmacy should be one of those anchor institutions at the very heart of her thinking. It's not just about reducing strains on GPs. It's about linking community pharmacies to job centres, to places of work, to civic society and to social care. And we at Res Publica believe that community pharmacies are the vital vehicle to achieving this and need accordingly the right kind of recognition from government. And my task in this report that my team are doing from Res Publica and that I'll be presenting in about a month and a half's time, is really making the case to government to try and stop cutting away at community pharmacies and to rethink them at the centre of wider social thinking in terms of the way that the Prime Minister wants this country to be going. Briefly, I see this in two key phases. The first, community pharmacies, they're not being listened to, but they keep saying they've got capacity and they want to be proactive. So let's give them a role. And I don't want to give them some Mickey Mouse role on a corner of a street where they might be checking 50 people's blood pressure out of a potential population of 5,000. Let's give them something which is a true flagship, something which can really be a kind of flagship project that community pharmacies can rally around and can be at the heart of the public perception of them. So at the moment, we have something called NHS health checks, which you'll all be familiar with, and they're applied to certain parts of the population. So if you're over 40, you're allowed to have them every 5 years. If you're a woman, you're allowed to have smear tests. If you have a chronic illness or if you've got a mental illness, you have access to certain forms of a kind of public health check made available to you through the NHS. Why can we not have that made universal? Using the public health grant from central money given to local authorities and given to all people, not just the over 40s, every 5 years. So all of us get a preventative check of our obesity, our diabetes and our blood pressure. And guess what? Community pharmacies are the institutions that spearhead that, so everyone in this country knows they have a vital and proactive role to play. Now, government would say, we haven't got the cash to do that. You know, we're already strapped, we've got to keep cutting. And I would say, do you not understand that if you don't get on top of the diabetes problem in this country and the obesity problem in this country, the long-term costs to the public purse are going to blow this whole society apart? If you're willing to give a smaller and smarter amount of money to a universal public health audit spearheaded by community pharmacies, you're going to have something which is much more cost effective in the long term. It's about being intelligent, not just going in with a blunderbuss of austerity. So that's one of the recommendations that I'll be investigating in this report, the idea of a public health audit spearheaded by community pharmacies. I hope that you like that, and I'll be interested to hear what your feedback is to it as an idea. In some ways, it's about talking about primary care and putting community pharmacies very much at the primary part of that primary care and really communicating that to the public. Second idea, in order for this to be achieved, we've really got to have a truly integrated way of looking at integrated healthcare. Now, we have existing strategic systems like health and well-being boards, but I get the impression that pharmacies are not always taken seriously within that strategic thinking. There's not always parity when it comes to CCGs or to ideas of sustainability and transformation plans. And what I'd like to see are, if you like, a sort of forum where PSNC, the LPCs, are at the heart of that, representing community pharmacies, in tandem with local community leaders and GPs and local government, at the heart of health and well-being boards as equals to make decisions about local public health for the local public population. And if the government wants a rationale for that funding which I'm advocating in a public health audit, it's precisely that integrated forum that could justify that. So in some ways we want to put community pharmacy really at the heart of an integrated way of thinking about public health, on the same level as GPs, which I think is what Ian was talking about. But just to finish, that would require, I think, two things. It would require scaling up the role of pharmacies, but dare I say, it would also require standardizing the role of pharmacies. Now, you might disagree with me, but when I look at some of the LPCs out there, they vary depending on geography. You can have a fantastic one in London, but perhaps a less effective one in other parts of the country. So I think pharmacy has a role to play, but also has a duty to put its own house in order if it wants to justify its place at that kind of integrated primary healthcare forum that I'm suggesting. So, in conclusion, the report that Res Publica are writing for the National Pharmacy Association is really trying to put community pharmacies at the heart of a wider social reform programme and at the heart of an integrated primary public healthcare for the future of the country. Thank you.
Well done.
Really good. Thank you, James. That's the kind of analysis you think you might get to hear before the government have made up their mind about something. And I suppose the resident Tory here, James, I'm going to ask you this. Do you think the government has a mindset already? Because this is the letter that Philip Hammond wrote to the Prime Minister in August last year, basically stating that it was a bad idea, inefficient, to spend 30% of the value of medicines to get them into patients' hands, that longer term, the government wanted to see a shift away from what they called traditional bricks and mortars business towards scaled up innovative supply, employing digital technology, effectively Amazonization is sometimes it's called, where the community pharmacist is bypassed with a computer on the GP's desk and everything happens without the sort of traditional safety net that we have from experienced pharmacies. My concern is there a mindset that you need to break through to get that message delivered?
The government are barbarians when it comes to public institutions.
That's Tory barbarian.
Yes, but I told you that I'm the red part of the red Tory. We are seeing over the past 10 years something really dangerous, folks, we're seeing public institutions, forget politics now, this goes beyond party politics. We're seeing public institutions in this country, often unique to this country, at the heart of civil society, being sacrificed on the altar of austerity. What happens when that takes place is that people are put to one side and they are replaced by machines. And that is why it doesn't surprise me that we're seeing an Amazon-like future for community pharmacies instead of that local or often family-run institution which used to be at the heart of high streets and neighbourhoods.
Okay.
This is something which has to be pushed back. And I would say this for any Conservatives out here, and I suspect there aren't any, if you care about conservatism, so this is what I say to Conservatives, read your Edmund Burke, go back to the roots of conservatism. Edmund Burke, it wasn't about free marketeering anti-statist. That's Ayn Rand. That's an American kind of import that we've had in the last 40 years. Conservatism is the party of civic society, what Edmund Burke used to call the little platoons that represented neighbourhoods and communities. So yes, a conservative stands against the welfare state, stands against centralisation, but it isn't replaced by the free market, it's replaced by you and I. And community pharmacies, like post offices, like churches and temples, and all the other institutions we see out there, are and should be at the heart of conservative thinking.
Thank you. Very few copies of Burke down in that bookshop at the conference centre. Any questions, immediate questions? So, hi. Thank you.
My name is Nicola Edwards. I'm from the ENITE. I also work for NHS&L Commissioning Support Unit. 3 years ago, we did a big push with pharmacists, optometrists and dentists to get them onto NHS Mail because NHS England were keen to involve community pharmacists, optometrists and dentists more in expanding services like referral services, health checks, etc. And it was a fantastic project right across South London, which NHS England actually took up right across the country and now promoting through what was HSCIC and NHS Digital. That gave me, as a lead on that, technical lead on that project, I work in IT, an opportunity to talk to a lot of community pharmacists. And one of the things that came out was how they were struggling in terms of IT infrastructure. There was no investment. They were reliant on family and friends to help them out coming in. There was no money from the centre at all because they were just seen as this unseen service that helped the NHS out. And given the cyber attacks in May, a lot of pharmacists contacted myself as the named contact that they had and said, what can we do to ensure that our systems are secure? We're really, really worried. There's absolutely very little for them. The big pharma industries, the Boots, the Superdrugs, the Sainsbury's of the world, they're fine. They're represented by industry body Pharmacy Voice. They help them out in terms of providing them with that subject matter expertise. The other thing that I will say is what the gentleman was just saying around how important they are in the community. A friend of mine looked after an elderly lady on her road, just knocking on the door every now and again to make sure she was all right. She had complex medical needs. She would go and pick up her prescription on a regular basis from her local independent pharmacy. My friend went on holiday and the elderly woman was due to pick up her prescription and didn't turn up. The pharmacy realised that she hadn't come to pick up her prescription, contacted the GP practice, who then contacted the named contact that they had for her. She had no relatives. And the alarm was raised and the emergency services were called. And it turned out she'd had a fall and she'd been laying on the floor for several hours. That's how important community pharmacies are as a community services. And it's just absolutely unseen.
Any gathering like that, these stories happen all the time with that link between the community and the community pharmacist. The IT link is actually, there was one of these debates last week in Bournemouth when the IT issue was also addressed. There was a couple of IT professionals there as well who literally said, if the government want the efficiencies that they seem to want, parts of the NHS have to begin talking to each other in a way that they don't. And that's just, I think that's a given before anything. Any immediate questions? This gentleman here.
Is it defensible?
Not to me. I know nothing about the subject.
Is it defensible that what you get from your pharmacy varies from place to place, even within the same town?
Ian.
So that people don't know whether there's a local, what they call a local scheme for minor ailments or whatever it is. So you go to one and there isn't one, so you assume there aren't anywhere you are.
That's a good question. I mean, go back to this lady. You know, we've got to remember what pharmacies do is keep people living independently in their own homes for longer. And they do that through a whole array of things. Drivers, which we pay for. They're reprogramming DVDs. They're assembling flat packs. They're lifting people off. I mean, they're doing all kinds of things. You never hear about it. But when you think about it, what they're really doing is keeping that person living in their own homes for longer. Now, what would be the demand on social care or on residential care? What kind of problem would they have if these pharmacies contract their hours and suddenly are not able to provide that service? Going back to your first question, it's around commissioning. And the commissioning is so fragmented and so unorganised, and the government are pushing more and more out towards local commissioning. They want to hold on to the supply function centrally, but they want to take that commission service. So you could live in Bolton or Bury, and you could find a smoking cessation. Well, you'd be lucky to find that now, but would be commissioned through a pharmacy. You could then go into Yorkshire and Bradford and Halifax and find out that there's nothing. So you're right, there's a lack of consistency, and there is no real transparency. And at the end of the day, it's the patients who are the losers.
Any other questions?
Yes, I'm a councillor. I represent Penzance on Cornwall Council.
Yeah.
I'm also a member of the Health and Wellbeing Board of that council. The leader of the council is the chair. I asked him, what is the Health and Wellbeing Board for? And he said, well, I don't really know. What do you think we should be doing, Cornelius? Right. So I was very interested in what you were saying about universal health checks, which in my experience are quite sporadic, the way they're operated by GPs now. But the only thing that alarmed me a bit is like the sort of funding we get from public health that's been handed over to us is pretty fully stretched, dealing with a sort of wide variety of addiction problems and everything else that public health is coping with in Cornwall, which has actually above average those issues, above the national average, contrary to the rosy image that's obviously painted of Cornwall. So if you were going to have this sort of universal health check thing, which I think is a really interesting idea, and it would perhaps be organised by the local authorities, the public health section of the local authority, I could see that would be the best way to do it. But who's going to pay for it? Because I don't think we can.
If I may briefly, James,
sure.
This is the point I was trying to make. It's about getting the message across. You can't go to government, particularly this government, and say, give us some more cash. It's just not going to happen. They want to, and this isn't just about pharmacies, this is across the board. I wrote a report for the Foreign Office and the British Council over the summer, just the same problem. Reduction of investment from government, they want justification for what they're spending their money on. You've got to make the case for smarter use of central funding, taxpayer funding. Now, I think that the way forward for community pharmacies is twofold. First of all, the message is that prevention is always cheaper than the cure. So back to the obesity and the diabetes problem. If you spend money smartly through community pharmacies now to prevent an explosion of obesity or diabetes across the country, it's going to be a little bit expensive now, but it's going to be a lot cheaper than it will be in 25, 30 years' time. So we've got to somehow get that long-term thinking back into government policy, which is difficult, but that's one way forward. And the other way forward, to answer this gentleman's point, is community pharmacies, dare I say it, need to get their act together a little bit more. They need to take themselves more seriously. They're not a poor man's GP. I want to hear from someone, perhaps from a PSNC or an LPC, to explain to me why there's such a variety between pharmacy representation and partnership and output across the country. It's not good enough to have a pharmacy partnership in one part of the country, I won't name which one, that has one person working 15 hours a week looking after a numerous amount of pharmacies across the whole county. That's not good enough. If you want to have pharmacies taken seriously, at the heart of the wellbeing boards that you're talking about and justifying the government funding that I'm talking about, they need to scale themselves up, and standardise their offer.
James, can I just quickly come back? This is almost presented as if we're surprised that this is needed. You know, there has been, if you like, there was a white paper in 2008, the idea of, you know, presenting an opportunity to improve patient care. There was the Royal Pharmaceutical Society report in 2013. There's been pilot studies. There's talk of transformation partnerships and integration funds. A lot of, from a journalist perspective, I think it must look confusing as to what actually government, and I mean, you know, both the Labour government and coalition government and now Conservative government, what do they want from you? Is there a confusion? Because it looks like that from the outside.
So the white paper and the reports that I cited tend to make the clinical case, compellingly so, for community pharmacy. I guess what I'd like to look at is the social case. So it isn't just about talking about obesity, but saying there is a quantifiable link between BMI and worklessness. So there's peer-reviewed journals out there producing articles looking at that. There's a quantifiable link between mental health problems and social exclusion. And those social problems also have a cost. So there's an extra layer which a Prime Minister like Theresa May, who talks about social reform and just about managing, should be listening to because it's in her kind of language.
Can I bring in?
I just wanted to say something briefly about the question about government thinking about pharmacy. I just think they're not really thinking much about pharmacy. They've got limited bandwidth anyway.
Because they're thinking about something else.
I think they're thinking about one or two other things that aren't being discussed much here. But I think pharmacy suffers in the policy environment something akin to what it suffers in the pecking order of clinical professions, that it tends to be looked down upon. It's that's one of the elephants in the room. Speaking personally, my father is a retired pharmacist, so I have some insight into where pharmacy has traditionally been in the pecking order, and I think that continues to some extent. So I think policymakers probably, unless they're incredibly creative and imaginative like you are, probably aren't thinking very much about pharmacy, and so
you want them to.
It's not even whether it's cock-up or conspiracy. I think it's kind of just getting them to think harder about the potential of pharmacy.
And just, James, just very briefly, and I promise to stop talking, so I've spoken too much. This is the end of my kind of tuppence worth. No. We say that the government doesn't understand it. I read in the newspapers today that they are proposing that GP receptionists should be the first point of triage for our primary healthcare system. I mean, I'm sorry, no offence to them, they're fantastic professionals, but if I had a chronic ailment or if I needed seriously to be looked at by a healthcare professional, why am I not being sent to a pharmacist? Why am I being sent to a receptionist? Absolutely. It just doesn't make sense.
Before we move on, any other immediate questions? I'm going to go back to Burke now. Did Burke not the political philosopher who said a party was a sort of slightly dangerous thing, and he liked the idea of independent thinking MPs? I think he said that. Yeah. So maybe we have an independent thinking MP with us this evening. Julie.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to the NPA for organising this event, and I'm privileged to be able to speak here. As been said, I'm Member of Parliament for Burnley. Since coming to Parliament, being elected for the first time in 2015, health was an interest of mine. I served on the Health Select Committee, and I was very pleased to be asked to join the Shadow Health team last October and to take responsibility for community health. It's a happy coincidence because within that remit is community pharmacy. I do happen to have some extra knowledge about that I bring, and I'm very pleased to bring here. My husband's a community pharmacist, 24 years of ownership of a community pharmacy in one of the most deprived communities in the country gives me an insight into some of the issues we're talking about today. So looking at the title of our debate today, relieving pressure on the NHS. I've been involved in two discussions early today with my health hat on about just that subject. one with the Royal College of Physicians, one with the Royal College of General Practitioners. And we've heard at great length things that aren't new to me, because I'm hearing them every day and having conversations with doctors and medical professionals the length and breadth of the country. The NHS is at a crisis situation, and it cannot go on. And it seems to be outside the Conservative Party, everybody else seems to accept that. Jeremy Hunt's in denial. But apart from that, the real world and the medical world understands and accepts. So it seems to me that it is foolish in the extreme to not value community pharmacy. I understand from first-hand experience that no health professional is better placed to relieve some pressures on the NHS than community pharmacists. Community pharmacists are very well qualified. For those of you who don't know, I mean, many of you will be pharmacists, but in case, we need to stress this, even if you know it, we need to stress it. They are very well qualified health professionals and the most accessible health professional that we have in the land. No appointment necessary, no barriers of any kind, physical or psychological. The public, the general public, and I say the public rather than patients because it's actually not just about ill health, it's about well-being. The public can walk through that door. Yes, they can go through the door for a prescription, and yes, they can walk through the door to get the paracetamols. But there's so much more than that, and that's what the government is missing. I think there's a genuine ignorance there in government. The conversations I've had with my counterparts in the government show that they do not understand. They see community pharmacies as dispensers of prescriptions and people who sell paracetamols. They don't get the wider role. When we were serving in our pharmacy, we were really proud to offer a whole range of practice services. And the landscape was different then. We had PCTs followed by CCGs. We're actually willing to commission services. We did anti-smoking cessation, minor ailments, medication use reviews, advice on diet, diabetic testing, blood pressure testing, you name it. There was a whole list of things that we were happy to support the community with. And that's before you start to look at the whole potential for promotion of well-being, which is what we all want to see, I'm sure. To manage demand on the NHS, we need to promote the well-being of the nation. Now, the average pharmacy does thousands of prescriptions every month. That is, in our case, we were doing 10,000 prescriptions a month. That's 10,000 opportunities for a positive intervention, advice, and that's just the people who come in with a prescription. The ones that come in to say, well, actually, my little boy's got this, or actually, I'm trying to lose weight and I've been struggling. And people are embarrassed sometimes to go to make an appointment to discuss something. Often have a relationship with a pharmacist that actually surpasses that because the pressures on GP surgeries is so great, and because there is such a turnover of GPs now, people responding to the pressures by seeking early retirement, and it's very hard to retain practitioners. Often the community pharmacists can be the only bit of continuity for people with chronic ailments, etc., who need support, a trusted individual. And we're putting this at risk. The government's changes are putting this at risk, and it's to all our cost. And actually, what they should be doing, what they ought to be doing, and what a Labour government will be doing, given the opportunity, is to sit down with the sector and say, well, actually, you've said you can do more. That's what we're interested in. How can you take pressure off the NHS? How can you expand and enhance the services that you offer? They're the only profession, it's been mentioned already, the only healthcare professional that's standing up there and saying, we want more work and we don't want any more pay for it. Just treat us fairly, pay us a fair deal. I mean, this obsession with that it's money wasted, and they talk about. I mean, they try to confuse the public. This idea that we'll take away the establishment pin. These pharmacists, they point the finger at community pharmacists and say they get £25,000 just to be open. Well, what they don't say to you is that it costs more than that to put a delivery van on the road to deliver a prescription, not to mention that's before you pay the driver, delivery. There's no remuneration for that. Pharmacy, there's a tremendous amount of goodwill there, and pharmacies are absolutely chomping at the bit to do more and to enhance their offer to the NHS. And I think what we're seeing is a very dangerous position, because the thing we're now having faced with is another attack on community pharmacy, as there's now to be a downgrading of how community pharmacies are supervised. It's okay now, it's going to be all right for dispensing technicians, if the government get the way, to step in instead of these very highly qualified professionals. We've spent years, we've spent money training people, but never mind, they don't matter anymore. Let's let the dispensing technicians, and there's nothing against dispensing technicians. We employed 3 and they were amazing, did a really good job, but they did what they did. It's a bit like saying, see a receptionist instead of a GP. It's not the same. And I think we're on a dangerous path here, a very dangerous trajectory. We've also got the government talking about online pharmacy. I mean, is this the first step to, when you devalue the profession and the service and the standard, what's next? Is it next we all go online and we get our medication there, and it's the Amazon courier? I mean, just think about it. It demonstrates to you how your child's going to use their inhaler, etc. I think this is a very dangerous path that we're going on. We are respected worldwide for the high standards of patient care in this country across all sectors of the NHS, and this represents a severe erosion of that. And that's the patient perspective, which obviously, even coming from a community pharmacy background, has got to be my first consideration and will be Labour's first consideration. But of course, there's the economic well-being of the community pharmacists across the country. And there is no doubt at all that if the government do not rethink the funding of community pharmacies will close. Communities will lose out, pharmacists will lose their income, and that's undone. And promotion of the well-being of the country must be in all our interests, because it's not about spending money, it's about investment, and this government does not get the difference. There's a world of difference between spending and investment. Investment, bending up front, long-term yields. This is not the well-being and improving the health and well-being of this country is not a quick fix. We have a problem. It's not going to be fixed quickly, and anybody who says it is lying. But we do have to invest in improving it, and it will take time. But invest we must. And that's not just, Labour throw money at things. It's about sensible action, proactive action to protect and promote the well-being of our population. And it's a no-brainer. This is very, very worrying what we're seeing from government. Thank you.
Well done.
I find it quite encouraging that you hear that. Usually the traditional kind of Labour refrain at the end when you're talking about a manifesto in an election, it's simply that Labour will spend more money. And then 5 years down the line, the same problems exist. If you're talking about, as a shadow minister, a commitment to a reorganisation and re-architecture of the relationship between community pharmacy inside the entire health service, then that should be in your manifesto. There shouldn't simply be more money. No, I mean the one that's coming, however quickly that's going to be.
Sue Sharp's got her hand up.
Say again?
I think Sue's got her hand up.
I was about to just say thanks. Yeah.
I just wanted, there's a fantastic summary from Julia what pharmacies do. I just wanted to talk about 2 things that have happened this month that all the community pharmacists here will know. One, the largest wholesale supplier to pharmacies completely closed for 5 days from the 7th to the 12th of September. It was unable to distribute medicines at all, and this is one of the largest manufacturers of medicines exclusively distributes through this wholesaler. The second thing that happened is that 2 major generics manufacturers were put out of business, or partly put out of business, closed down by the MHRA, the regulator for quality assurance programs. And guess what? Outside pharmacy, most people don't know about it. And most people don't know about it because pharmacists somebody said last week, begged, borrowed or stole, but pharmacies worked to make sure that patients who needed medicines got them. Whether it's by splitting packs of medicines, whether it's by going to wholesalers with whom they've got no relationship and paying way over the odds to try and get hold of medicines.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is even on the medicine supply side. It has been the most phenomenal success story, and so nobody knows about it. Nobody says, my God, that was a catastrophic risk that pharmacy averted. So I just wanted to add to what Julie was saying, the very basics of making sure that people who need medication, which is probably 90% of all the healthcare treatment that we offer for people with long-term conditions in this country, that the job of making sure that patients who need medicines get medicines is not something you take for granted.
Is that a failure of the market? So is it a failure of the market, or is it community pharmacy making up for a failure of the market?
Stuff happens, occasionally, we've had it before, generic manufacturers, something goes wrong with the systems, or there are global shortages of the active ingredients of medicines, or manufacturers have a problem with accessing the supplies they need. All these things happen, and they always will happen. What I'm saying is it's community pharmacies that will try to make the waters as calm as they are out there for the patients who depend on medicines for their well-being.
Thank you. Any hands? The gentleman at the back. Picture on.
Hi, I'm Paul Day from PDA, which is a trade union of 27,000 pharmacists. One thing I just wanted to say was Happy World Pharmacist Day, because actually in terms of the profile of pharmacists, today is the day. So just to say that to you, but also just to say, on behalf of our members, we're absolutely, as well as the pharmacies, the pharmacists absolutely want to be delivering safe care to people to help that pressure and to save the NHS and to do all of those things. But they're frustrated, they just cannot do that, and often find themselves with certain circumstances, not any that have spoken, under pressure with that commercial pressure, challenging their work as clinical health professionals, which is really, what a waste of competency to have such expert medicine managers in place and unused. Yeah. Appalling. Thank you.
Is there any of the community pharmacists in here who have something to say on rationing or rationalisation? Something that came up in previous debates where community pharmacists were saying there was pressure on them not to use certain medicines, certain over-the-counter medicines. They were being discouraged from that. The BMA there's been debate inside that. Any thoughts on that before we move on to Jeremy? Just yeah.
It's only my own experience in the fact that I have a back problem and I wear a pain patch, fentanyl patch, and my pharmacist was concerned because they were forced to use a different type, and I reacted badly to that. Also with asthma, a different inhaler, which only had a year's shelf life on it, as opposed to 2 years from the previous brand, which to me was like, again, they were being forced to use what they were saying to me were, inferior brands, and not necessarily using their own experience of what is the best brand.
And has that changed any?
They're being forced. They're being told that they can only supply the brands that the GPs are saying, or government, I assume is probably involved in it, are saying that they have to use. So,
and can I come to you?
Thank you very much, David Baker. I'm director of the Dispensing Doctors Association. As I think we said last week in Bournemouth.
Renewing a conversation we had there.
Yes, the problem is that CCGs are insisting that their GPs prescribe branded generics. These are tablets that have come off patent and have been provided as a generic, but then a firm will produce a cheaper form of that generic as a branded product and persuade the CCG to use it because to the CCG it appears to be cheaper. But as far as the cost to the NHS goes, it is absolutely no difference. In fact, it is slightly more expensive, which is absolutely ruddy ridiculous. You've got to have a national policy, not local variations as to what you can use or not use. And if GPs don't follow their CCG's advice, they can get penalised for using what is supposedly the wrong medication, even though the advice from central government is prescribe generically.
My reason of bringing it up was, what we're discussing here is efficiencies. We're trying to find areas where money is saved so money can be better used in areas where it's more important. Now, if there is a degree of rationing, and that's positive rationing, then fair enough. But community pharmacists must be on the front line knowing how this, if you like, pressure is coming and how it affects their own patients. I mean, Ian, you must have experience of that. Can you?
Look, the thing's a constant battle. You're getting branded generic prescriptions that you can't obtain. What do? You're in a situation, I'm supplying you a medicine. It's written as a brand. It's the same drug. You know, I'm breaking ethical consideration if I'm supplying you that, but at the end of the day, I've got to put your interests first. And as this gentleman has quite rightly articulated, they're not cheaper. The cost to the taxpayer is they're not cheaper. And it's ludicrous. And if they truly want to reduce the cost of medicines, if they work with the sector, James, if they work with the sector, we could reduce the drug budget, because there's lots of things we can do. But it does require a change in attitude, and it requires a change in approach to all of this. We could significantly reduce the drugs budget if they work with the sector, because we're the experts in this field. Yeah. We know it.
Do you want to come in, James? Yeah.
No, well, yeah. Just to say, as a kind of layman, so I've got about bogged down in this whole kind of drugs and medicine and contracting, and is it 95% or 50% and CCGs, and I appreciate that's really central to your lives. I appreciate that. And your economic viability is dependent on that, and it's a big headache for you. I get it. For me, that's one service, prescribing medicine, which is a big headache for you, and it's an economic consideration. What I'm talking about is this triage process of primary health care and a perception amongst the population of public health. So instead of going to the GP receptionist, we go to the pharmacist, and it's for you guys to say, I can't look after you, you've got to go to a GP or accident emergency. I can look after you, then we're going to dive into the quagmire of drugs and medicines, which I'm not going to get involved in myself. Or, I know you because you come in every week or month and you're part of my community, therefore I'm going to proactively look after you. I want to end this panel on a really positive rallying cry for you from the perspective of a layman, which is to say, don't get bogged down in the kind of spider's web of drug contractual arrangements with government and subsidies and how all that works, because it's drowning you. And try and get above the level of water and see that you've got a really vital role to play.
Okay. Get the government to go above that level, and then we might get somewhere.
I'll do my best.
If the government to do it, we're going to get nowhere.
I'll try my hardest.
Okay, we'll come on to our final speaker, Jeremy Taylor. Just in case, it's been a long time since I introduced Jeremy. As I said, he
it's okay, you don't have to reintroduce me.
Chief Exec of the National Voices Coalition of Health and Care Charities in England.
I kind of feel I should be quite brief because I'm the last person keeping you from whatever you're doing next. And also I've got to go. I've got to go at 7:30 to go to something else. So I'm not even going to stay the course for this. Apologies for that. I also feel the need just to wind things up a little bit because there's been an awful lot of consensus. And I get slightly annoyed with too much consensus. It becomes a bit boring. So I'm going to start by saying that I don't think it's the job of pharmacy to save the NHS. And indeed, it's not the job of any one profession to save the NHS. And I always feel slightly uncomfortable about being invited to take part in a conversation about a particular profession, because there's always a danger that you end up colluding in provider interests or professional vested interests rather than thinking about what's in the interests of patients. So I want to kind of reframe the framing of this event and not talk about the role of pharmacy in saving the NHS. If we're going to save the NHS, it's going to take a number of things, one of which is creating a person-centred, joined-up, preventative, holistic primary care service that is focused on population health, that is personalised and person-centred, that is built around the needs of individuals, and in which professions of all kinds work together as a team to deliver better health outcomes. And pharmacy absolutely has a really important role to play in that, as one of a number of players. So I'm just going to, I'm being very rude to my hosts by kind of throwing back in your face the notion there's something incredibly special about pharmacy, and of course there is, but it's not unique, and it only really works as part of a joined up whole. So, for that to happen, there actually needs to be a proper process of joining up primary care, and despite the 5-year forward view and the very good vision in that document, actually the implementation of joined up services is not really going at the pace that we would want, and the funding problems and the cuts that we've been talking about in community pharmacy are a particular aspect of a more general problem in my view, which is that not only is the whole of the NHS underfunded, but we have too much money going into the acute sector as a proportion and not enough going into primary care. And as a thank you. I wasn't expecting that. You're an informed audience, so you'll know that as a proportion of total NHS spend, the amount of money going into out-of-hospital care, broadly defined, has been declining at the very time that all the policy has been about how it's important to invest more in primary and community services and join them up better and join them up with social care. So the policy direction is absolutely opposite to what's happening in practice. And pharmacy is suffering because of that, because of the overall level of funding for primary care, and it is suffering because, as I was saying earlier, I actually think policymakers are not sufficiently interested in pharmacy. I think that's a problem. That's just my personal prejudice and speculation. I have no particular evidence base of that, other than having been a civil servant once in the past, so having some insight into how ideas are formulated in government and what's sexy and what's not sexy. Sadly, pharmacy, not unlike other parts of health, suffers from a lack of sexiness.
Ian's suit's very nice.
Many individual pharmacists can be very sexy, but the profession as a whole doesn't have sex appeal, and that's a problem. So I'm a great fan of community pharmacy, but I'm also a great fan of pharmacy generally. So I think Ian was perhaps a little bit snippy about clinical pharmacy, and I would say what's really fantastic about pharmacy is a number of things. One of which is the notion of community anchors and a pharmacy on the high street everywhere. I think that's really important, and I think it is a good case to make that it isn't just about the economic impact, it's about the wider social impact. But the skills and training of pharmacists are also really important, and those skills add value, whether it's in a community pharmacy setting or whether it's embedded in general practice or in hospitals. So I wouldn't want to decry pharmacy which doesn't take place in community pharmacy. And that's where I make the distinction between what I would say see as being in the wider public and patient interest and what might be, inadvertently slipping out sort of professional vested interest in particular ways of delivering services. Having said all that, I have no doubt in my mind that there is a much greater role, and we haven't realised the potential of this, for pharmacists to be active in public health. I'm not entirely sure I quite buy into universal health screening for absolutely everybody. I'd rather target it at those who are most likely to need it. Otherwise, you get the inverse care law coming into play, and you probably get a huge problem with overdiagnosis and overmedication. So let's not make it universal, but let's think about how we can smartly target it. And I think there probably is a lot more that we can do to smartly target based on the NHS health checks that already exist and based on the concepts and practice of healthy living pharmacies, which I think we could probably do on a bigger scale. I've also got no doubt that pharmacies could play a much bigger role than they currently do in helping people manage long-term conditions. My understanding is, and I'm not an expert on Scotland because we tend to cover England, that they're ahead of the game in terms of seeing a really systematic role for pharmacies in helping people manage their long-term conditions, which is good for the patient as well as taking the pressure off GPs. It's also better for patients, and patients really welcome it. And I think one of the other reasons why I want to kind of reframe the exam question for this session is that if you just talk about relieving the pressure on the NHS, you're taking the attention away from delivering good outcomes for patients, and that's what it should really be about. So what stands in the way of a greater role for pharmacy in public health in supporting the management of long-term conditions and being generally more of an active, joined-up player in the out-of-hospital care system? We did a little bit of piece of work with the Royal Pharmaceutical Society earlier this year, and we got together some patients, some practitioners, some members of our member charities, and we workshopped some issues around how could pharmacy play a stronger role in helping people live with and manage their long-term conditions. And it was very interesting. It spoke to some of the public perception problems that have been already alluded to in this event. So one of the things that people fed back was, I like my pharmacists, I like pharmacy, but I'm not quite sure pharmacists really have the skills and clinical skills and understanding that I would really trust them with. So I know they understand medicines, and so one person, there's a quote in the report, "I think my GP knows my condition better than my pharmacist does." So I think this is not a scientific sample, and it's not huge polling. It's just a little bit of workshopy stuff, so I don't want to overplay it. But it speaks to a public perception of pharmacy that still sees it quite narrowly and transactionally as being about dishing out medicines and having some advice around that. Certainly when I think about my own father and his stories about being a pharmacist, it was, he's a very optimistic and, glass half full sort of person, but there was a kind of narrative of bitterness about the kind of decades of dismissing his clinical skills and failing to understand that he was highly trained and had a lot to offer. I think that plays out in public perceptions a bit. Are these guys really up for it clinically? The second thing that came up was, I can't see how the pharmacy joins up with the rest of the NHS. So in theory, I really like the idea of pharmacy playing a more active role in helping me manage my long-term conditions. I think that sounds like a really cool idea, but they're not joined up with the IT. They don't speak to the GPs very much. They're in their kind of retail setting that's separate from the rest of the NHS. So certainly the level of perception in the work we did, some of the feedback was, we don't quite see how pharmacy joins up. And then the third thing was, we're not quite sure that pharmacy is the right setting for some of the more sensitive and private conversations that pharmacists clearly want to have to be able to demonstrate and use their clinical skills in consultations. So we get that could happen, but we kind of think these are busy retail environments, it's a shop. Is that the right place to have some of these conversations? So, as I say, that is not a public opinion survey, that's just a little bit of qualitative research and workshopy stuff that we wrote up. But it does tend to suggest that there are some perception issues around the extent to which pharmacy joins up with the rest of the NHS, the extent to which pharmacists have the right clinical skills, and whether the environment is suitable. I don't think I'm saying anything that people haven't heard before. So what do we do about this? I kind of think, I want to echo actually what James was saying earlier, that to some extent we're not going to crack government policy, we're not going to crack government funding of the NHS anytime soon, although I think we could all start to get a bit more angry about the erosion of the NHS constitution and some of the basic planks of the NHS that we're seeing starting to, bit by bit fall off because of lack of funding, compounded by workforce problems. But we're not going to solve that tonight, but I think there is something about the pharmacy profession, the community pharmacy sector, actually being more proactive and going out and selling their wares, selling your wares a bit more aggressively. Because I think you've got a fantastic offer, and I think to some extent you're ahead of public understanding and perceptions, ahead of patient understanding and perceptions, and I think there's a really strong opportunity to go out and demonstrate what you can actually do based on what's already happening. So this isn't, we're not reinventing the wheel here. All the things I've been talking about already happen, but they don't happen systematically and across the whole of the NHS. So all power to your elbow. I think you need to kind of assert yourselves a bit more strongly. Thank you.
I'm just going to touch on one thing before I bring Ian in. You talked about primary care there. That's almost like going back to the original kind of Bevan idea of what the National Health Service is supposed to be. And you also touched on almost a degree of professional elitism when maybe they're all colleges of general practitioners. Maybe we have high expectations. We bring elitism to it as well. And it's not just necessarily then pressure has to be put on the government to do what community pharmacy does. There's actually changes in the professional relationships that pharmacists have to have. It's not just one thing.
I think that's right, and I didn't say this, but I think there are things that could happen that would send very strong signals to patients and the public about interprofessional collaboration and status. So at the moment, one of the reasons why pharmacists are seen as being the people who dish out the medicines is because that's essentially how they're treated. The GP makes the decision, the clinical decision, and the pharmacist hands out the medicine. But you could have a situation where the GP in consultation with the patient says, this is actually quite difficult because there isn't an obvious answer to your medication issues. Let's phone up the pharmacist and have a conversation, a shared decision-making, three-way conversation about what is the best medication outcome for this particular patient. My guess is that is happening possibly somewhere, but I don't think it's routine, and I don't think public expectations have caught up with that. Yeah. But amongst other things, that sends a very strong signal about this is GPs and pharmacists working together as equal status, highly trained professionals.
Right, thanks. Jeremy, I am going to come back because there were some comments deliberately directed at me, and I think that's
just to wind you up.
All right. Well, you've got to understand the context of my comments about clinical pharmacists, because the rationale for deploying clinical pharmacists by NHS England in doctors' surgeries because community pharmacists were being portrayed as not being clinical enough. It's nonsense. And when I make those comments, these are pharmacists who've been on a 4-year degree course and a clinic and a postgraduate. And if you only got to look to the Alberta model in Canada, where ordinary community pharmacists were liberated to reach that potential to change the system. And it's worked. Now, when I say that, there was some postgraduate training, but it wasn't along the lines of an independent prescriber. It was basically pharmacists as the gateway to their primary care. And they were changing, and this is out of 12 of 13 provinces, and I'll send you this, Jeremy, changing drug formulations of medicines, making therapeutic substitution, prescribing for minor ailments and conditions, initiating drug therapy independently, ordering and interpreting lab tests, administering drugs by injection. I don't just mean flu, I mean a whole stack of injections. Somebody's missed a Hep A. What's the point in giving them the first one if they don't get the second? So they did it. And they did it there and then. And these were community pharmacists like me. They use technicians, and there's a role for technicians. Of course there is. Pharmacists were stretching across all of that agenda. And the impact of that is that it took caseload off the doctors. That's it. That's what pharmacists like me are doing in Canada. The point I'm trying to make is that we are clinical. And we've got to stop this thing, because this is what is coming out of NHS England, that we're not clinical enough. It's nonsense. If you believe in the potential of the network, and if you liberate the potential of these pharmacists, by God, can they deliver? And all we're doing at the moment is just...
Before I bring in James and Julie, is there any immediate response from the floor? Yes.
Can I just, I didn't want to do any anecdotes, so I'm going to avoid that. GPs under the new National Health Service model are looking at patients symptom by symptom, and those symptoms are appointments apart. The local pharmacist who sees you as a human being that's not a pound sign that is just John or Dave that's walked in on the last 25 years, is seeing you as a whole person with all those symptoms and all the drugs and the issues you've got. And sometimes they're the only person that can say, actually, you've been given X for that symptom, but if you take it with Y for that symptom, you're going to be really ill. And they will be the only person that will call the GP to say, you've made a mistake.
Okay.
And that happens time and time again.
Can I just quickly...
But I need to quickly go to my comrade. She said that the devaluing of pharmacists. It's not the devaluing just of pharmacies, it's the devaluing of patients, the National Health Service and us as human beings that the Tories are doing. And that needs to change. We are all equal and we all have a value.
That criticism could be labelled at the Labour Party over the last 20 years as well. So just thinking on that. Can I think we've got allocated 2 hours here, but I think this is a debate we've gone quite deep into this. So can I ask just for a final comment from James and a final comment from Julie, and then maybe there's time for an early glass of wine. Just quickly, James.
So very quickly, it was a question really for you rather than a comment, but perhaps afterwards you could chat about this with me. I'm not as wound up as Ian, Jeremy, but I'm still perplexed by one thing which you suggested, which was this pushback about the idea of a universal public health audit. And I'd like to hear from you at some point, either today or later on, and the lady who said here as to why that would be a bad idea. I get the problems with inverse care. I understand it's not good to give more jam to rich people. I understand the problems with overdiagnosis. I feel for the poor people who came to have blood pressure tests here and then 4 of them were sent to hospital by you guys. Right? So I get the problem. But I also understand one key thing about a certain demographic. Just as you have hidden forms of poverty in this country, something called in-work poverty, you can also have hidden forms of health inequality. Someone like me never goes to the GP. Right? A man in his late 30s, early 40s, kind of fit. I could be a ticking time bomb for all I know of any sorts of ailments, and there's no preventative structure every 3 years or 5 years in a cost-effective way to deal with people like me, where someone comes and says, we're just going to give you a quick once-over. Please could someone explain to me why that would be a bad thing?
I'm really not an expert on this, but I think the danger is, as I understand it, there are kind of two things. The way people in the audience are probably better able to answer the question, maybe they should. One is the resource that you spend on hunting for healthy people like you, who may be a ticking time bomb, but probably aren't. That's money that could be spent on directly targeting and helping people with known health problems. So that's one way in which you're maybe not allocating resources as effectively as you could. I think the other objection, it depends on what kind of tests you do. But it's the false positive problem that you identify things that actually probably aren't that problematic, and they lead to a whole lot of interventions that were unnecessary. Yes. So those two risks are always there, but they become greater the more comprehensive your screening or public health testing becomes.
It's funny that my wife is a professor of medicine, and she's come back from a conference, and it lasted a week on this very discussion. So we've had a couple of exchanges from 2 professionals over 5 minutes, whereas doctors, I think the conference was somewhere in the United States, spent 4 days talking about that. So can I just ask Julie to finish? Just a final comment
Absolutely.
Before we move.
Absolutely. I just would like to pick up on a couple of things as well that James meant. He's certainly sort of stirred the panel up. But what I would say is that I've had lots of conversations with Conservative health ministers about the role of pharmacy. And they are really deluded. And some of the things that ministers have said to me is, it's about time they got integrated in the primary care team. Well, they are integrated. I think you commented on that. They have been for a long time. And actually, there's been a step backwards under the Conservative government. There was an initiative from the previous Labour government to make pharmacies in the community centres of clinical excellence. Consulting rooms were built, and your other comment about what being shops. Pharmacies are pharmacies, they're not shops. It's not like going to the little grocery shop. That the pharmacy professional can speak in there to a customer patient in a private setting, conduct tests in a clinical environment, and the profession is very proud of achieving that. And what we've seen is a backward step, pushing community pharmacies back to, selling bars of soap and shampoo. That's not the best that community pharmacy can be. And I would say that we are looking, a future Labour government will look for an enhanced role to absolutely maximise the skills that we as a nation we've paid for. Taxpayers' money trains community pharmacists. Let's use the skills, let's help them, work with them to let them take some pressures off the NHS. Yes, on their own they're not going to save the NHS, of course not, they're not. But they have a very important contribution to make.
I don't know how... I don't know how we get all of this on the side of a red bus. The next manifesto. But I think the discussion that we've held tonight has been honest, quite in depth, and is a bit more honest than 350 million quid a week. But can I just express my thanks to the panel for what they did, and also to you for some educated questions. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, just a couple of closing remarks from me. First of all, the issue of clinical. I believe that word clinical has been thrown into the mix to make us divisive. We don't talk about general practitioners not being clinical. Community pharmacists are generalists. They are not specialists in particular areas, but they deal with a whole host of problems, and they can refer them into different healthcare settings. So I think that is a bit of a misnomer to talk about pharmacists in GP surgeries as being clinical and pharmacists elsewhere in community practice as being non-clinical. That is very far from the truth. Just one point on that. Secondly, I just want to remind people that we are doing blood pressure checks on our stand. For those that haven't been on the first floor, please attend those tomorrow and check your blood pressure. This gives you an example of one thing that community pharmacy can do. Of course, on the stand, the limited time that we have, we can't demonstrate the full range of services that community pharmacy offers. But the community pharmacy of today and tomorrow embraces healthcare and wants to work with IT, for example, offer a more integrated solution to our other healthcare providers. We're not shying away from anything at all, but it has to be understood by commissioners all over the country that we are the solution to some of the problems and not the problem. Community pharmacy, your front door to help the message here, and we can help relieve the pressure on the health service. I'd like to thank our panel who debated this issue in the limited time that we had in very great depth, and our chair, of course, who was terrific in holding this all together. So thank you very much. There's a bit of wine left, I understand, over here. Wish you all a good night.
Thank you.